When the galaxy's elite military academy strips you of all technology on a hostile death world, what do? The alien cadets panicked when their atomic printers fried, but Nathan Cross didn't need a quantum tool. He had 2 hands, some mud, and 1,000,000 years of human instinct. The wind on Tartarus 9 didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a relentless, high-pitched howl that tore through the jagged canyons of the planet's southern hemisphere, carrying with it a chilling dampness that seeped into the marrow. This was the site of the Galactic Coalition Cadet Academy's final survival exam. Passing meant a commission as a ranking officer in the Coalition fleet. Failing usually meant waiting for emergency medevac, assuming the rescue drones could find your thermal signature in time. Nathan Cross adjusted the straps of his heavy survival pack, his boots sinking an inch into the spongy, moss-like ground. He was the only human in Squad Delta. The rest of his team consisted of species from core worlds that had eradicated manual labor centuries ago. To comply with standard coalition communication protocols, their complex native designations had been localized by the neural translators into standard Western names. There was Carter, a 4-armed, blue-skinned saurian whose species was renowned for their tactical brilliance and absolute reliance on algorithmic combat. Next to him stood Bennett, a towering, slender avian with iridescent feathers and hollow bones, possessing an intellect that could process hyperspatial navigation in seconds. Finally, there was Simon, a heavily plated, silicon-based bruiser who looked like a walking boulder, heavily dependent on his powered exoskeleton to maneuver in standard gravity. "Atmospheric pressure is dropping rapidly," Bennett announced, his voice a melodic chirp filtered into flat English by the translator. He was tapping frantically on a holographic wrist console. According to the meteorological data, a Class 5 supercell is approaching from the northern ridge. We have exactly 4 hours before temperature drops to -30 degrees Celsius, accompanied by razor hail. "No need to panic," Carter said, waving one of his upper arms dismissively. He unclipped a heavy, silver cylinder from his belt. It was a Genesis-class matter printer. "We have the standard issue Coalition Survival Kit. I will deploy the Quantum Bubble Shelter. It provides a thermal-regulated force field, complete with automated nutrient dispensers and a heated floor. We will pass this survival trial playing zero-G chess." Nathan remained silent, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had grown up in the rugged mountains of Colorado. His grandfather, William Cross, a stubborn off-the-grid survivalist, had taught him that relying solely on a battery was a fool's game. Before joining the academy, Nathan had worked as a structural engineer in Chicago, studying the works of real-life architectural pioneers like Fazlur Rahman Khan, the man who designed the Sears Tower. Nathan knew that true strength didn't come from a microchip. It came from understanding gravity, tension, and the earth beneath your feet. "I wouldn't celebrate just yet, Carter," Nathan said quietly, pointing toward the churning black clouds boiling over the jagged mountains. "Do you see the green luminescence bleeding through those clouds? That's not normal lightning. This planet is known for severe ion storms." Carter scoffed, his 4 eyes blinking out of sync. "Human paranoia. Coalition tech is shielded against standard electromagnetic interference. The shelter will deploy in 3 minutes. Carter set the cylinder on the ground and pressed the activation rune. The device hummed, projecting a dazzling blueprint of a domed fortress into the air. Nanites began to swarm out of the base, constructing the foundation molecule by molecule. Then the sky tore open. There was no sound at first, just a blinding flash of emerald light that washed out all color from the landscape, followed instantly by a concussive wave of pressure that knocked the entire squad off their feet. Nathan hit the dirt, covering the back of his neck as the air instantly tasted of ozone and burning copper. When he looked up, the holographic blueprint was gone. The Genesis-class matter printer was smoking, a thick black sludge leaking from its ruptured core. Simon, the silicon-based heavy, let out a distressed groan. The glowing blue lights on his powered exoskeleton flickered and died. He collapsed to his knees, suddenly burdened by the immense, unassisted weight of his own armor. "My console!" Bennett shrieked, tapping furiously at his wrist. The holographic screen was dead. "It's fried!" The ion burst, overloaded the crystalline matrices. Everything is dead. Carter scrambled to the smoking cylinder, frantically pressing the activation rune with all four hands. "Reboot. Engage backup capacitors. Come on, you piece of garbage." He kicked the device, but it just rolled away. Nothing more than a useless chunk of melted metal. The reality of the situation crashed down upon the alien cadets like a physical weight. They were on a hostile world, stripped of the technology that had pampered their species for millennia. They had no comms, no force fields, no automated heaters, and a lethal supercell was just hours away. "We need to run a bypass on the motherboard," Carter ordered, his voice cracking with an emotion Nathan recognized instantly. Sheer, unadulterated panic. "Bennett, use your multi-tool to open the casing. Simon, see if your suit's reserve battery can jump-start the printer." "My suit is dead, Carter," Simon rumbled, his voice muffled behind a dark visor. "I can barely stand up. The servos are locked." "Then unlock them manually," Carter yelled. "We have to fix the printer. Without the force field, our biology cannot survive the sub-zero drop. We will freeze to death in a matter of hours." Nathan slowly stood up, dusting the damp soil off his knees. He looked at the smoking tech, then up at the darkening sky, and finally at the surrounding environment. They had been dropped in a river valley. The ground was thick, cohesive, and sticky. Along the riverbank, dense clusters of flexible bamboo-like reeds swayed in the rising wind. "Leave the printer, Carter," Nathan said, his voice calm, cutting through the rising hysteria. "It's slag. The core is melted. You couldn't fix it even if you had a sterile lab and a week to do it." "Shut up, human!" Carter snapped. "You don't understand the complexity of a quantum matrix. If I can just realign the focal lenses." "You're wasting time," Nathan said, unbuckling his heavy, now useless tactical vest and tossing it aside to improve his mobility. "We have about 3 hours before that storm hits. If you want to survive, you need to stop playing engineer and start acting like an animal. We need to build a shelter. Now." Bennett stared at Nathan with wide, avian eyes. "Build? With what? We have no nanomaterials. We have no kinetic bindings. We have no tools." Nathan reached down, scooped up a handful of the wet, heavy earth, and squeezed it. It held its shape perfectly, a dense ball of thick clay. He looked back at his alien squadmates and offered a grim smile. "We have mud," Nathan said, "and we have hands. That's all we need." For the first 30 minutes, the alien cadets completely ignored him. Carter and Bennett were huddled over the ruined Genesis printer, desperately trying to strip wires with their teeth and splice them together. Simon was trapped in his own heavy armor, trying to manually crank the hydraulic release valves just to regain the ability to walk. Nathan didn't bother arguing with them. In extreme survival situations, panic narrowed the mind. He knew he just had to lead by example. He jogged over to the riverbank and drew his standard-issue survival knife, a simple, fixed-blade piece of high-carbon steel that the aliens had mocked on the transport ship as a barbaric relic. Using clean, angled strikes, Nathan began hacking down the tall, bamboo-like reeds. They were incredibly sturdy, yet flexible enough to bend without snapping. He gathered dozens of them, hauling them back to a slightly elevated patch of ground that would keep them safe from flash flooding. "What exactly is he doing?" Bennett asked, glancing up from the ruined motherboard. "He is succumbing to primitive stress regression," Carter deduced, his 4 arms covered in grease. "It is documented in lesser species. When faced with insurmountable odds, their higher brain functions shut down and they revert to feral, nest-building behaviors. Ignore him. We must reroute the power grid." Nathan ignored the commentary. He took the thickest reeds and drove them deep into the damp earth, arranging them in a perfect circle about 10 feet in diameter. Once the primary pillars were set, He began taking the thinner, more flexible reeds and weaving them horizontally through the vertical posts, moving in an over and under pattern. He was building a wattle frame. It was one of the oldest construction techniques in human history, dating back thousands of years before the first steel beam was ever forged. It was the same principle of tension and compression used in modern composite materials, just expressed through wood and muscle. His hands moved with practiced rhythm. The repetitive physical labor warmed his body against the dropping temperature. Within an hour, he had constructed a sturdy, dome-shaped basket structure that stood just over 6 feet tall. Simon, who had finally managed to manually disengage his armor locks and step out of his heavy suit, lumbered over. The silicon-based alien looked down at the woven structure. "Nathan," Simon rumbled slowly, "the wind speeds of the approaching storm are projected to exceed 160 kilometers per hour. This basket will be blown into the canyon. You are expending caloric energy for nothing." "It's a dome, Simon," Nathan explained without breaking his rhythm. In structural engineering, the dome is one of the most efficient shapes for deflecting wind. The aerodynamic profile allows gale-force winds to flow over the top rather than pushing against a flat surface. Plus, the interwoven tension makes it incredibly rigid. Grab the top and pull down. Simon reached out a massive gray hand, gripped the woven rim of the structure, and yanked. The dome bowed slightly, but immediately snapped back into place. Simon blinked in surprise. The structural integrity is surprisingly high for untreated flora. "Exactly," Nathan said, "but it won't keep the cold out. I need your help. You're the strongest one here. I need you to help me make the daub." "Dope?" "It's a composite material," Nathan said, walking over to a depression in the ground near the river. He began tossing loose dirt, heavy clay, and handfuls of dry, fibrous grass into the depression. Clay provides the binder, sand provides compressive strength, and the grass acts as tensile reinforcement, just like rebar in concrete. "Now, get in here and start stomping." Simon looked at the muddy pit, then back at Carter and Bennett, who were still frantically failing to fix the printer. Realizing the tech was a lost cause, the massive alien stepped into the pit and began to march in place. His immense weight churned the earth, water, and grass into a thick, homogeneous paste. "Perfect," Nathan said, plunging his hands into the freezing muck. He scooped up a massive glob of the dense mud and walked over to the woven frame. With a heavy smack, he threw the mud against the woven reeds, pressing it deep into the gaps. "Carter! Bennett!" Nathan shouted over the rising howl of the wind. "Get over here. The storm is less than an hour away. That printer is dead. If you want to live, you need to get your hands dirty." Carter stood up, his blue skin turning pale from the dropping temperature. He looked at the human, covered up to his elbows in muck, violently slapping dirt onto a pile of sticks. "You are insane," Carter shivered, his teeth chattering. "You want us, officers of the Galactic Coalition, to play in the feces of the planet? We are a space-faring civilization. We do not build with dirt." "If you don't build with dirt," Nathan yelled back, his voice hardening into the tone of a commanding officer, "you are going to be buried in it. Look at the horizon." Carter and Bennett turned. Over the northern ridge, a terrifying wall of black clouds was rolling toward them like a tidal wave. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Flakes of ice began to strike their faces like tiny daggers. The reality of their vulnerability finally broke through their arrogance. Dropping their useless tools, the two aliens ran toward Nathan and Simon. "What do we do?" Bennett chirped, his feathers puffing up in a desperate attempt to trap body heat. "Grab the mud," Nathan commanded. "Slap it onto the frame. Pack it tight. Don't leave a single gap. We need thickness for thermal mass. The thicker the walls, the more body heat we trap inside." For the next 45 minutes, it was a frantic, desperate race against nature. The four cadets, a human, an avian, a saurian, and a silicon bruiser, worked side by side, scooping freezing mud and packing it onto the dome. Carter used his forearms to maximize efficiency, laying down layers of mud at incredible speeds. Bennett, despite his physical weakness, used his analytical mind to spot microscopic gaps in the ceiling, directing the others where to patch. Nathan worked like a machine, shaping the entrance low to the ground to prevent wind from rushing in, and leaving a tiny, fist-sized ventilation hole near the apex of the dome. Just as Nathan smoothed the final layer of mud over the exterior, the sky turned pitch black. A deafening roar echoed through the valley as the front edge of the supercell slammed into them. The wind hit with the force of a physical blow, knocking Carter entirely off his feet. Razor-sharp hail began to fall in sheets, shredding the foliage around them. "Inside, now!" Nathan screamed. He shoved Bennett through the low entrance, followed by Carter and Simon. Nathan crawled in last, dragging his survival pack behind him. He pulled a thick, woven bundle of leftover reeds into the doorway, plugging the entrance tight. Inside the mud hut, it was completely pitch black. Outside, the storm raged with apocalyptic fury. The wind screamed like a dying beast, tearing trees from their roots. They could hear boulders tumbling down the canyon walls, and the relentless machine gun staccato of hail battering against the exterior of their tiny shelter. But inside there was no wind. The heavy, dense walls of the mud dome stood resolute. It didn't shake. It didn't rattle. Nathan breathed heavily in the darkness. Checked the internal temperature. A faint glow illuminated the small space as Bennett activated a minor biometric scanner on his wrist, one of the few tools that didn't rely on the fried quantum grid. "External temperature is negative 34 degrees, Bennett whispered, his voice laced with absolute awe. "Internal temperature is currently 5 degrees and rising. The thermal mass of the wet earth is trapping the latent heat emitted by our bodies. It's working." Carter sat in the corner, his forearms wrapped around his knees. He reached out and touched the solid, damp wall of mud beside him. "No force field," Carter muttered in disbelief. "No energy grid. Just dirt. And it's holding back a Class 5 storm." Nathan leaned back against the curved wall, finally allowing his muscles to relax. "Never underestimate the basics, Carter. Technology is just a tool. But survival? Survival is an instinct." The storm raged on, but inside the primitive dome of dirt and sticks, the alien cadets looked at the human with a newfound, profound respect. The human hadn't just saved their lives, he had completely shattered everything they thought they knew about strength. The absolute darkness inside the Wattle and Daub shelter was heavy, pressing against them with the weight of the raging storm outside. While the thick mud walls successfully blocked the lethal, razor-sharp hail and gale-force winds, the cold was still an insidious enemy. The dampness of the fresh mud was acting as a thermal bridge, slowly wicking away the ambient heat their bodies were desperately trying to generate. Bennett huddled closer to Simon's massive frame, shivering violently. Internal temperature is stabilizing, but it is hovering just above freezing. My core temperature is dropping. If we do not introduce an external heat source, hypothermia will set in within 2 hours. Carter let out a dry, clicking laugh that sounded like rattling stones. "A heat source? The Genesis printer is outside, buried under a meter of ice. Simon's suit is dead." Unless our human friend can magically synthesize a fusion reaction with his bare hands, we are merely delaying the inevitable. "Not a fusion reaction," Nathan's voice echoed in the cramped, pitch-black space. "Just basic, rapid oxidation." They heard the rustle of Nathan's survival pack, followed by the distinctive sound of wood scraping against wood. "When I was 10, Nathan continued, his tone steady and focused, "my grandfather handed me a battered, physical copy of a book by John Lofty Wiseman, a legendary instructor from a real-life Earth military unit called the SAS. It was a manual on how to stay alive when the universe decides it wants you dead. The first lesson was about the triangle of fire: heat, fuel, and oxygen." "You cannot be serious," Carter groaned. "You are going to attempt friction-based combustion?" "Human, the ambient humidity in this enclosure is nearly 80%. The ignition point of standard cellulose requires at least 230 degrees Celsius. You cannot generate that with muscle spasms." "Watch me," Nathan grunted. He had saved a dry, dead piece of softwood from the riverbank, keeping it protected inside his waterproof jacket during the build. Using his knife, he quickly carved a fireboard with a small notch and a straight, hardwood spindle. He cut a strip of durable nylon from his packstrap to create a makeshift bow. He placed a bundle of completely dry lint and fibrous tinder materials he religiously carried in a sealed pouch for exactly this kind of emergency beneath the notch. Wrapping the nylon cord around the spindle, he anchored the top with a smooth stone and began to saw the bow back and forth. Skirk, skirk, skirk. The rhythmic sound filled the dome. Nathan drove his body weight down, pushing through the exhausting, burning ache in his shoulders. To the aliens, reliant on instant plasma torches and thermocubes, it looked like an act of desperate madness. But Nathan knew the physics. Friction created heat. Heat broke down the wood fibers into a combustible gas. A faint, sweet smell of toasted wood permeated the damp air. "Impossible," Bennett chirped softly, his avian eyes adjusting slightly to see a faint, dull red glow appearing near Nathan's boots. Nathan dropped the bow and carefully tapped the fireboard, knocking a tiny, glowing ember into the center of the tinder bundle. He scooped it up, cradling it like a newborn bird, and began to blow. He didn't blow hard. He blew steadily, feeding the fragile ember with oxygen. The smoke thickened, and then, with a soft whoosh, the tinder burst into a vibrant, dancing yellow flame. The light illuminated the inside of the mud hut, casting long, flickering shadows against the curved walls. The three aliens stared at the small fire with absolute reverence. It wasn't a sterile blue plasma jet. It was raw, chaotic, and beautiful. Nathan quickly fed small twigs into the flame, building a sustainable, smokeless fire in a small depression in the dirt floor. Almost immediately, the temperature inside the dome began to climb. The heat baked the interior layer of the mud walls, hardening the clay and turning the damp enclosure into a dry, thermally reflective oven. "Incredible," Simon rumbled, holding his massive stone-like hands toward the flames. "It is warm. You created thermal energy from debris." "Analog engineering," Nathan smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead. But the victory was short-lived. Outside, the storm shifted. The wind changed direction, violently slamming a massive, heavy sheet of ice against the top of the dome. Inside, the fire suddenly flickered and dimmed. A thick, gray cloud of smoke began to pool at the ceiling, rapidly descending toward them. "The ventilation hole!" Nathan shouted, coughing as the acrid smoke hit his lungs. The ice must have sealed it shut. Panic, raw and primal, instantly flooded the small space. Without an exhaust vent, the fire was rapidly consuming the limited oxygen inside the sealed mud bunker, replacing it with deadly carbon monoxide. "I cannot breathe," Bennett shrieked, dropping to the floor and gasping for air. Carter began clawing frantically at the mud walls, but the heat of the fire had already baked the interior layer into a rigid, ceramic-like shell. "We are trapped. We are going to asphyxiate." "Simon!" Nathan yelled, his eyes watering from the blinding smoke. He grabbed the massive alien by his armored shoulder. "The roof! You need to punch through the roof!" Simon hesitated. "If I compromise the structural integrity, the storm will breach the dome." "If you don't, we're dead in 2 minutes," Nathan coughed, dropping to his knees to find clean air. "Do it, now." Simon stood up, his head nearly touching the curved ceiling. He braced his thick legs, planted his heavy fists against the apex of the dome, and pushed with all the hydraulic-assisted might his failing suit could muster. The mud groaned, resisting the pressure. The exterior had frozen solid under the sub-zero temperatures, while the interior had been baked hard by the fire. The shelter had literally become a reinforced concrete pillbox. "I cannot break it," Simon choked, dropping to one knee. "Yes, you can," Nathan yelled, grabbing his carbon steel survival knife. He leaped up, driving the blade deep into the baked mud near the apex, creating a fracture line. "Hit it right here. All your weight." Simon let out a deafening roar. He threw his massive armored shoulder upward, striking the exact spot Nathan had scored. Crack. A chunk of frozen mud and ice exploded outward. Instantly, a violent vortex of freezing wind howled through the new, jagged opening, but it acted like a chimney, instantly sucking the toxic smoke out of the dome. Fresh, freezing air flooded the shelter. The four cadets collapsed onto the dirt floor, gasping and coughing, their chests heaving as they inhaled the life-saving oxygen. The fire, fed by the new draft, roared back to life, establishing a perfect equilibrium between the freezing exhaust and the radiating heat. They were alive, they were breathing, and the mud walls, though cracked at the top, held firm against the screaming night. The storm finally broke just after dawn. The howling wind faded into a solemn, eerie silence, leaving behind a landscape that looked as though it had been subjected to orbital bombardment. The jagged canyons of Tartarus, 9 were choked with snow and shattered timber. High above, a coalition rescue dropship descended through the clearing clouds. Commander Briggs, a grizzled veteran of the fleet, stared grimly at the tactical monitors. "No thermal signatures detected in Sector 4, Commander," the sensor operator reported. "The ion storm completely wiped the grid. The temperature dropped to -40 overnight. If Squad Delta's quantum shelter failed, they are gone, sir." Briggs sighed heavily. "Set us down near their last known coordinates. Prepare the body bags. I hate losing cadets to hardware malfunctions." The dropship touched down on a flat ridge overlooking the river valley. Briggs and a medical team marched down the slope, their boots crunching on the thick ice. As they rounded the bend, Briggs stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't see frozen corpses. He didn't see the sleek, glowing dome of a Genesis-class shelter. Instead, sitting in the middle of the devastated landscape was a crude, lumpy dome made of frozen mud and sticks. It looked like a giant, inverted bird's nest that had been flash-frozen into solid concrete. And sitting outside of it, huddled around a small smoking campfire, were 4 very alive cadets. Bennett was happily roasting a strange, tuber-like root on a stick. Simon was chipping ice off his armor, while Carter and Nathan were casually discussing orbital mechanics. Briggs lowered his visor, completely dumbfounded. "Squad Delta, report. What is the meaning of this? Where is your standard issue shelter?" Carter, the Saurian who had mocked Nathan the day before, stood at attention. He offered a crisp, perfectly executed fleet salute. "Commander," Carter spoke, his voice filled with an unfamiliar humility. "Our Genesis printer was destroyed by an EMP surge prior to the storm. Our tech was rendered entirely useless." "Then how are you alive?" Briggs demanded, pointing at the frozen mud hut. "What is that?" "That, sir," Carter said, glancing at Nathan with profound respect, "is human engineering. It utilizes 0 microprocessors, requires 0 battery power, and is entirely immune to electromagnetic interference. It is constructed from planetary biomass and thermal inertia." Briggs stared at the primitive structure. He walked up to it and struck it with his heavy armored gauntlet. The frozen, baked mud didn't even chip. It was as hard as starship hull plating. He looked back at Nathan, who was quietly tending the fire. The Galactic Coalition had spent trillions of credits developing technology to insulate themselves from the harshness of the universe. They had engineered weakness out of their biology, relying on machines to do their surviving for them. But looking at the human dirty, exhausted, yet entirely unbothered by the brutal world around him, Briggs realized a terrifying truth. Humans didn't conquer the stars because they were the smartest, or the strongest, or because they had the best technology. They conquered the stars because, when you strip away all the metal, the lasers, and the quantum grids, a human is still the most dangerous, adaptable creature in the galaxy. Give them dirt, give them sticks, and they will build a fortress. "Cadet Cross," Briggs said, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Outstanding work. Pack up your gear. You're going back to the academy. Nathan kicked dirt over the fire, smothering the flames. He slung his pack over his shoulder and looked at his alien squad mates. They weren't just a team anymore. They were a unit, forged in fire and ice. "Ready when you are, Commander," Nathan said. As they walked toward the dropship, leaving the frozen mud hut standing defiantly against the harsh alien landscape, the universe suddenly felt a little less intimidating. Because as long as there was dirt beneath their feet, humanity would always find a way to survive. Technology can fail, but human instinct is forever. Nathan's incredible survival skills just prove that sometimes the most advanced tool in the universe is a pair of human hands. If you love this HFY sci-fi drama, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans, and subscribe for more epic tales. What would you do without tech on a hostile world? Let us know in the comments.